ربهم وما الله بغافل عما يعملون. ولئن أتيت الذين أوتوا الكتاب بكل آية ما تبعوا قبلتك وما أنت بتابع قبلتهم وما بعضهم بتابع قبلة بعض. ولئن اتبعت أهواءهم من بعد ما جاءك من العلم إنك إذا لمن الظالمين. الذين آتيناهم الكتاب يعرفونه كما يعرفون أبناءهم وإن فريقا منهم ليكتمون الحق وهم يعلمون. الحق من ربك فلا تكونن من الممترين. ولكل وجهة هو موليها فاستبقوا الخيرات أينما تكونوا يأت بكم الله جميعا إن الله على كل شيء قدير. ومن حيث خرجت فول وجهك شطر المسجد الحرام وإنه للحق من ربك وما الله بغافل عما تعملون. ومن حيث خرجت فول وجهك شطر المسجد الحرام وحيث ما كنتم فولوا وجوهكم شطره لئلا يكون للناس عليكم حجة إلا الذين ظلموا منهم فلا تخشوهم واخشون ولأتم نعمتي عليكم ولعلكم تهتدون. كما أرسلنا فيكم رسولا منكم يتلو عليكم آياتنا ويزكيكم ويعلمكم الكتاب والحكمة ويعلمكم ما لم تكونوا تعلمون. فاذكروني أذكركم واشكروا لي ولا تكفرون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا استعينوا بالصبر والصلاة إن الله مع الصابرين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
أفلح من أعاد الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. Brothers and sisters, respected Shaykh Usama, once again, welcome. Assalamu alaikum and Shahr Ramadan Mubarak. Alhamdulillah, we're really blessed to be able to continue the lecture series on Islamic beliefs. And we left off on the section of the book called Divine Promises. Inshallah, that is what Shaykh will be continuing throughout the month of Ramadan. Just a quick announcement or reminder for anybody who didn't kind of catch it. Inshallah, tomorrow we will be having iftar together after the program. But that does mean that we're going to start the program a little bit later. So tomorrow the doors will open at 6:45 and the program will begin at 7. Inshallah, we'll hear from Shaykh and then we'll pray together and then there will be iftar. So inshallah, if we can just keep an eye out for that. And without further ado, inshallah, it's my honor and pleasure to welcome Shaykh Usama Abdulghani with 3 loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين لا سيما بقية الله في الأراضين روحي وأرواح العالمين له الفداء رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So dear brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Ramadan Mubarak to each and every one of you. Brothers and sisters, welcome to this year's Ramadan program. And this year, what we're doing, as Brother Tariq shared, is that we're going to be going over divine promises. But just to clarify something that he shared, what we had completed so far as a group was the lesson lesson number 4. So that was faith through action. So brothers and sisters, remember, we were talking about the all-important Quranic concept of Quranic faith or Quranic iman. In order to have iman, faith, according to the Quran, there are 3 conditions. 3 conditions. So one of them was the intellectual conviction. We personally have to be convinced that Islam is the truth. It can't be taqleed or me following someone else. The second one, though, is that it's not just mental acrobatics. It's not just that in my heart of hearts, I'm absolutely sure that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created me, that there is a last day, there is a Yawm al-Qiyamah. That is not Quranic faith. And this is really important because for us, faith means salvation, means paradise. Okay. So it wouldn't only be that. It's not only the mental acrobatics. And so then, if somebody does believe in Allah and Yawm al-Qiyamah, their actions are going to be different. If I believe in Allah and the last day, my interaction with you is going to be different. I'll end up praying and fasting and salah and all those other duties that Allah has for the mu'mineen. But then came, this was the one we haven't gotten to yet, the chapter, if we were just going by the order of the book, our next chapter would be called Faith and Selective Duty. And that's really an important chapter. That's one of the chapters, or one of the third condition of faith. The third condition of faith, brothers and sisters, is where many believers, many mu'mineen, they leave the chat. That third condition, many people, you'll see when we cover it, selective duty. Some of you may want to read ahead because it's better if we read ahead and then we have these concepts firmly in our minds and in our hearts. But many people don't have the third condition. That chapter on selective duty is very, very important. Normally what we would do is that we would cover that chapter. But what we're going to do now is something slightly different. Instead, we'll try to spend the next several nights talking about Allah's promises, divine promises. So what happens is that we people have been hardwired, have been created so that we're transactional. We provide a service, we do something, we're expecting something in return. What Allah talks about in the Quran is what He will do for you if you are a mu'min. So the leader in the book only spends two of the lessons on that. He summarizes it. He explains there could be like 40 promises in the Quran, but he covers a few of them. Inshallah, if Allah gives tawfiq, we'd like to cover some of those promises, but in a bit more detail over the month of Ramadan. In addition to covering the promises, then we'll try to touch on that third condition of faith. So we're going to spread out what we find in the third, or in that really important chapter, Faith and Selective Duty, over the course of the lectures. And as you'll see, if this one could be fixed, it would really hasten the reappearance of the Imam. But inshallah, we'll try and do that. Now, what happens, brothers and sisters, is as you know, we look at the ayat of the Quran together. The beautiful thing about the month of Ramadan is that for each verse of the Quran that we cover, that we read, we get the thawab of doing khatam of the Quran. So I'm going to be sharing those verses. Brothers and sisters, inshallah, we'll be looking at the verses. We'll be reading the verses together. So, we'll start with salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Brothers and sisters, the hope is that after we cover the divine promises, you and I will see why it is that we say that a person who has God on their side and has those kind of promises is literally a giant killer. We're going to cover one of the verses today to talk about it, but it's not a slogan. Inshallah, once we cover the promises, then you'll see why it is that when Allah says that He expects you to take on 10-to-1 odds and win, it won't seem like a stretch, right? Because we'll have looked at the promises of God, we'll see what God gives the believer, and it'll make sense. Yeah, that's true. I should be able to take on 10-to-1 odds and still win. Example. So brothers and sisters, if you can turn now to Surah number 8 and verse number 65. So 8:65, let's see if I have this verse of the Quran correct. And if anybody on the brothers or sisters sides, if you have that verse, then let me know, and then we'll all read the verse together. We're going to answer, the first question is, why is it that someone who believes in Allah's promises is literally a giant killer? Okay? So, does anybody have that verse? Okay, let's see if I quoted it correctly. Does it start off this way, brothers and sisters? Ya ayyuhan nabiyyu. Okay, let's read this together. Ya ayyuhan nabiyyu. So, O Prophet, harrid al-mu'mineen ala al-qital. So encourage the believers, push the believers, fire the believers up for qital, for doing war. Then God gives the promise. This one, remember later, because we're going to talk about the coming of the Imam. Okay? Later on, the last part of the speech, if Allah gives tawfiq. God says this. إِن يَكُم مِّنكُمْ عِشْرُونَ صَابِرُونَ. So we know we're talking about believers. If among you believers, among you, عِشْرُونَ صَابِرُونَ. If there are 20 patient people, then God says, يَغْلِبُ مِئَتَيْن. They will overwhelm 200. وَإِن يَكُم مِّنكُم مِّئَةٌ. What about if you have 100 of the mu'mineen? He says, يَغْلِبُ أَلْفًا مِّنَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. You will be able to overcome 1,000 of those who do not believe. So brothers and sisters, if you've noticed, this isn't limiting your capacity that you're only capable of taking on 10. Your strength is 10 over, right? One Muslim to over 10. So your ability is more than 10. But then how many more than 10 can you take on as a mu'min or mu'mina? That would be our iman and our patience. Okay. So we're going to talk about some fun facts when it comes to God's promises. Some fun facts. One of them is that this is what separates the men from the boys. The people who are able to do modern day miracles, and inshallah I'll try and share some examples, are people who truly believe in Allah's promises. They can take them to the bank. An example, Imam Khomeini. The leader was talking about Imam Khomeini, and he said this, I take God as my witness. The leader saying, I take God as my witness. Never in my life have I seen or heard about someone who took God's promises more seriously and thought more of God, thought better of God. Imam Khomeini was so convinced of the God that he served that he was able to do things that normally people would have said, well, this is impossible to do. Right? So that's one thing. It separates the men from the boys. The second one is that you'll see this is one of those areas where the mu'min differs from the munafiq. We're going to go over a verse of the Quran. The munafiqeen, brothers and sisters, they think when you and I believe God's promises to be so true, they think it's fool's gold. They think we're delusional. You're taking it so seriously. Let's do something real. I'm going to give you a real life example, but let's look at first of all a verse of the Quran, right? So what do the munafiqeen say? So this is the difference between iman and nifaq. So Surah Baqarah, brothers and sisters, see if you can turn to Surah number 2 and verse number 13. Surah number 2 and verse number 13. Do you guys have this? Does it say, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ? Yeah, any of the sisters have it? Okay. when it is said to them, إِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ آمِنُوا, believe, كَمَا آمَنَ النَّاسِ, believe like the people believe, take God's promises to be true. What do these people say, the munafiqeen? قَالُوا, they say, أَنُؤْمِنُ, should we believe, كَمَا آمَنَ السُّفَهَاء, like the fools, the simple people? Should we believe like them? They think it's a game, it's a joke. I'll give you an example. One of the things that you and I talk about is the importance of the Day of Quds. We talk about faith-based resistance. We talk about the necessity of us coming out all over the country and all over the world and standing up and protesting. Immediately, some people come back to you and they'll tell you, but what good does it do? What effect does it have? And for you, brothers and sisters, who are engaged in the clarification jihad, that's one of your responsibilities, is to explain to people, well, what does it do? What is some of the difference that it is making? But I'll give you another one. This is the part, remember, the difference between the mu'min and the munafiq is I believe God's promises. God's promises to me are more real than any scientific law. So now, if I believe God's promises, one of the promises that the leader mentions in the book is the idea that the efforts of the believers never go to waste. It's never the case that a mu'min or mu'mina does what they can. It might be something as simple as Sayyidah Maryam in the Quran, shaking the tree to get the dates. A palm tree, she's shaking it, but she had to do her part. God does the rest. Our question should be, is this an example, our Quds Day rally, an example of faith-based resistance? Am I doing what I can? If you're doing what you can, God does the rest. It's not, He promises many ayat of the Quran, nothing goes to waste. God will make it happen. But anyhow, that was just one example. So again, the munafiq, the person whose faith is very weak, they can't take God's promises as seriously as you can. They think, oh, come on, let's talk about something real. The other one about God's promises, brothers and sisters, is that these promises are not limited to the akhirah. God's promises, they're not only for the akhirah. That somebody say that Islam, if I practice Islam, if I'm a very good mu'min, in the akhirah, in the next life, I am going to enjoy, and those people, they will be in hell. No, actually, God's promises are for here. Right? I want to give you some examples. So, this one, brothers and sisters, if you can turn to surah number 40. Surah number 40 and verse number 51. Surah 40, verse number 51. Let's see if we can see this, if I was able to quote this one correctly. Question, are God's promises only for the akhirah? No. So 40, 51. Anybody find it? Any of the sisters, any of the brothers? Okay. Sisters, anybody? Yes? Okay. Let's read this together. So God says in the Quran, Inna, right? Truly we. Lanansuru. Definitely we assist, we help. Rusulana. We definitely assist and help our messengers. Who else as well? Walladhina amanu. And those who believe fil hayatid dunya, in the life of this world. So God's promises are not just for the hereafter. Rather, they're going to make us a powerhouse here. These promises, brothers and sisters, are also the secrets of the universe. You can take them to the bank. The same way that a law of science is real, these sunnah of Allah are also real, and God never lies. I want to give you the real life examples later, but let's just kind of go pace by pace slowly, and we'll get to the examples. Okay, so one of them, Surah 3, brothers and sisters. If you can turn to Surah 3 and verse number 9. Again, multiple places in the Quran. Let's see if we can turn to 3 and 9. Anybody have verse number 3, surah number 3? Any brothers? 3:9. God says in the Quran, Inna Allah la yukhliful mi'ad. Truly, Allah never breaks His promise. Now, what happens, brothers and sisters, is that actually these laws are more real than scientific laws. Not just that my faith is at the same level of faith as real laws. The true sign of Iman, we're going to read a hadith from Amirul Mu'mineen, is that I take God's promises more seriously than I take what's tangible. My belief in the unseen is stronger than my belief in the tangible. This is a hadith from Amirul Mu'mineen. He tells us that this is the sign of faith. La yastuqu imanu abdin. So the faith of no abd, there is no abd, no slave, no believer. La yastuqu imanu abdin. No one's faith is real or true hatta, until yakuna bima fi yadillah awthaqa bima fi yadih. Until the person believes what is in Allah's hands more than what is in theirs. That's the sign of faith. Now, why would you and I say that it's more real than a scientific law? I'm going to share verses of the Quran, brothers and sisters, but what you're going to learn from these verses of the Quran is that God can bend the laws of the universe to work for you. There can be a law of the universe, a scientific law, a reality. God can bend those realities for you and make things happen. This was part of what's going to make you that giant killer. Okay? So, as an example, brothers and sisters, we've learned the story of Nabi Ibrahim. I just want us to go over the verse of the Quran because we can see it for ourselves. Right? But God's laws being stronger than the laws of the universe, the scientific laws that everybody takes so seriously. God can bend those laws. This is now from, let's see if we can turn to Surah number 21. Surah number 21 and verse number 69. 21:69. God's laws being stronger than the scientific laws. God bending the laws of the universe. So you guys should have this. Let's see if you find this verse, if I'm quoting it correctly. God is speaking. So God says this, Qulna, we said, Ya nar, O fire, kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. God told the fire, fires burn. The fire, if you remember when we talked about the story of Nabi Ibrahim, they literally made it a Jahannam. They used a catapult to fling Nabi Ibrahim into that fire because the fire was so savage. God made that fire bardan wa salama. He made it cool, he made it nice, he made it cold, he made it safe for Ibrahim. Now, you and I, we believe in a story in the Quran where there was a wooden ship sailing in oceans of towering waves. We believe that ship made it safely. Just for context, brothers and sisters, before we look at the ayat of the Quran, ocean liners, right now, ocean liners, when they go in the ocean, one of the things they're concerned about are what they call rogue waves. A rogue wave is a wave that's like, let's say, 100 feet tall. The idea is, can this ocean liner sail not from the time of Nabi Nuh, can they sail and then be able to go up against a rogue wave? Okay, 100-foot wave. Brothers and sisters, a garden variety mountain is 1,000 feet, right? They're saying 100, right? This is 1,000. So now let's look at the ayat of the Quran again to see how God can bend the laws. So, if you can turn to Surah number 11, Surah number 11 and verse number 42. 11:42. 11:42. If you can turn, so anybody have it? 11:42? Brothers, sisters, anybody? Yeah? Sisters? Okay. Let's look at this verse. So Allah is talking about the boat of Nabi Nuh. He says, وَهِيَ تَجْرِي بِهِمْ فِي مَوْجٍ كَالْجِبَالِ. The boat is sailing with them. A wooden boat. I'm going to cover the verse, right? A wooden boat in waves like mountains. Nowadays, we're struggling with 100-foot waves, right? Another verse about the story of Nabi Nuh, if you can turn to surah number 54. Surah number 54 and verse number 13. 54:13, just again to understand a little bit about what God does and what God did. So Surah 54, verse number 13, God says this about that boat of Nuh. God says, وَحَمَلْنَاهُ, so we carried him, right, that boat of Nabi Nuh, عَلَى ذَاتِ أَلْوَاحٍ وَدُسُرٍ. It was a boat made of wooden planks and nails, and it's sailing in waves taller than a mountain, and God kept it going. Okay, so now just a little bit about that. One of God's promises for the mu'mineen, for this world, one of God's promises is that God will make the universe be on your side if you're one of the believers. Every atom will be fighting for you. Brothers and sisters, we believe this world is aware and actively worshiping God. One of the things that you and I will be happy about in Yawm al-Qiyamah is that this building, right? These are inanimate objects. This table, this building, the Hadi building, will testify that you worshiped here. It's alive, it's aware. They're actively worshiping God. But what happens is, Allah makes this world work for you here. I want to give you some practical examples, both from back in the day with ayat of the Quran, and then modern day examples for us to see this, that God makes the universe beyond this is just one of God's promises, if you are a believer. Okay? So let's just look at one of the verses of the Quran that talks about this. Brothers and sisters, if you can turn to Surah number 7. Surah number 7. And verse number 96. Surah 7 and verse number 96. And we'll look at this verse together. What Allah says in the Quran is this. So anybody have it? 7? Okay. Let's read this together. وَلَوْ أَنَّ أَهْلَ الْقُرَىٰ, if only the people of the villages and cities, amanu, they would believe, wattaqaw, and have taqwa, and be God-wary. What would God do? God says about the dunya, لَفَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ بَرَكَاتٍ مِّنَ السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ. God says that definitely we would open for them barakat, blessings. We would rain down blessings for them from the heavens and earth. God will make the universe work for you. Amirul Mu'mineen, the way the Prophet told Amirul Mu'mineen was slightly different. The hadith is this. He told Amirul Mu'mineen that God revealed to the earth, Ukhdumi man khadamani. Serve the one who serves me. God told the dunya, these inanimate objects, serve the one who serves me. Okay. Now, if you, brothers and sisters, look ahead to this part of the chapter later on your own. So page number 93. One part of it is the promise of what God will do for you in the dunya. And I'm going to cover that in the ayat of the Quran. The leader makes a subtle point over there. I don't know how many people got that point. Not only will he make the inanimate objects work for you, he says there's a bigger gift that God gives you. The bigger gifts is that God will open your mind. You will now, your creativity, your understanding, your potential, that will also be opened. You'll be playing chess while others are playing checkers, right? And that because you as a human being, you're greater than the universe. Yes, the universe also will be working with you, but in addition to that, God makes your mind work. Now, I want to give you some examples from history, but using ayat of the Quran. Again, let's keep in mind the principle. The principle is that God makes this world work for you. I'm going to give you some examples from the Battle of Badr. Now, if you look at some of what we find from the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, you'll find that the entire history of the Prophet was very rich, But let's look at this particular hadith that they say is from Imam Sajjad. The Imam says this, Kunna nu'allim, right? So we used to teach maghazi Rasulullah. We would teach the battles of Rasulullah, kama nu'allim as-surah min al-Quran. The same way that we would teach surahs of the Quran, make sure everybody knew them, we would go over the details of the history of the Prophet, the battles of the Prophet, so that it becomes something that's now a collective understanding. Okay? I want to mention not all of God's. So Allah discusses the Battle of Badr in many places. We're looking at one aspect of the Battle of Badr, which is God making the universe work for you. That's one aspect. I'm not talking about all of what God mentions in the ayat of the Quran about the Battle of Badr. I'm not covering all of that. Just some parts of it. Okay. Salawat, please. So, brothers and sisters, I would like to recommend, because again, you and I, we have to work in smaller circles, and we'd like to deepen our own faith. I would like to recommend that brothers and sisters buy a book or look at this book online. It's called The Message by Ayatollah Ja'far Subhani. Very nice history of the Prophet, just to go over the various events. You'll get a lot more out of the history of the Prophet the more you know about it. Anyhow, now with the Battle of Badr. With the Battle of Badr, just for a little bit of context to understand what we're talking about and why this divine help was so needed. The believers, this is their first major conflict with the Quraysh. The believers have been persecuted. The believers have been hunted. The believers are not used to going toe-to-toe with those guys. Actually, for the Battle of Badr, what happened was the believers, their wealth had been confiscated in Mecca. The mushrikeen still had an axe to grind. The mushrikeen, because they don't fight qurbatan ilallah or qurbatan to the idols, they have to pay their soldiers. Their soldiers are mercenaries. They decided to send a caravan to go to Syria to raise money to then pay the soldiers to then go wipe out the Muslims. The Prophet, through wahi, realized what the plan was. The believers set out for the conflict with the caravan. The Muslims are hoping that we're going to get this caravan. The caravan's a lot of money. Caravans are light. It's not like you're facing a full-fledged army. Yes, there is security, but you're not facing a full-fledged army. You take that caravan, it'll be a win. The Muslims were in such bad shape. 313 of the Muslims went out. But many of the Muslims didn't even have swords. This is just how financially they were, right? 75% of the Muslims in the Battle of Badr don't have swords. They have clubs. Because you're stopping a caravan, right? 313 guys. I mean, you chase down the caravan, you hunt them down, take out the clubs. I mean, it's pretty easy, right? The Muslims had 1 or 2 horses. They said the Muslims had 70 camels. So what that meant was that the Muslims would be sharing a camel. The Badr is 95 miles away from Medina. So you're marching 100 miles in 5 days, and you're sharing a camel. So it's 3-4 of us for a camel. I get on, I ride, I walk, I take my stick, your turn, right? That's how the Muslims were. And you're hoping to get, right? Now what happened was, these tired Muslims who now walk this, who've never been in a battle, Allah knew the Muslims needed a win. Sometimes you need a win to get your confidence, right? The Muslims needed a win. Now what happened is, the Muslims are thinking that we're going to go and get a caravan, but you show up and now you're fighting a full-fledged army of people who've been bullying you for 13 years. And they're armed to the teeth. Right? Because they came out, Abu Sufyan, you heard, he heard that the Muslims are coming. He escaped, but then he sent a message to tell everybody, come out of Mecca, they're trying to get the caravan, that's your money. The guy came rushing into Mecca, the horse riding on the camel backwards, made the camel all bloody, everybody's rushing out. And so now they send out this army to finish off the Muslims. The Muslims are not prepared for a war, first time, but they really need a win. How did God make these Muslims win? Remember God's promise. He's going to make the universe work for you. It seems inanimate. It seems random. God's making it work for you. The Muslims are terrified. What does God do? This is just some of the promises. I'm going to mention some of them later that are just interesting to hear, okay? Inshallah, if I remember. Surah 8, brothers and sisters. Surah 8, verse number 11. You see, brothers and sisters, sometimes you need to sleep. Being able to sleep is a blessing. If you're really panicked, sometimes you're so stressed you can't, and that keeps you from being your best. What did God do for the Muslims? We're going to see two things. So let's just turn to the verse together. Surah 8, verse number 11. And you're going to just see part of what God did in order to make the Battle of Badr a victory, because the Muslims were not going to win that. So what did God do? God says, so 8:11, إِذْ يُغَشِّيكُمُ النُّعَاسِ. So remember, when Allah made you, He covered you with a sleepiness. The Muslims are going to go over and face this big battle. They need to get their hands dirty, but they're not prepared. One of the things that help them psychologically is to get rest and be ready to face those guys. The other thing God says, He says, وَيُنَزِّلُ عَلَيْكُم مِّنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً. He also caused rain to descend. What happened? Why did they need rain? Two reasons. One of them, the Muslims were able to take a ghusl before the battle began. But the other thing that happened was the rain that landed on the side of the Muslims, the sand where the Muslims were, became firm. It was a light rain. It made the sands firm for the Muslims to be able to advance. On the side of the enemy, God made it rain hard. The ground was muddy and sloppy. So they're trying to advance and they're struggling through their thing. And the Muslims are moving because God made the grounds easy for the Muslims. Okay, what happened was God also messed with the eyes of the believers and the mu'mineen. What happened? Initially, the mushrikeen didn't want to rock and roll with the Muslims. They were like, there's no way. The Prophet only came out here with 313 people. They were afraid of the Prophet. They were afraid. But God said the Muslims need to have this thing. So God did something, this is now the physical world, to the eyes of the Muslims and the eyes of the enemy. So this is now another one. This is Surah 7. Surah 7 and verse number 44. 7:44. So if you guys are there, Surah 7, verse number 44. Let's look at the Arabic of the Quran and see what God did to help the Muslims win. وَإِذْ, so remember, يُرِيكُمُوهُمْ إِذَا الْتَقَيْتُمْ فِي أَعْيُنِكُمْ قَلِيلًا. God, those Muslims were a little nervous. One of the things God did was to make the believers see the enemy as few. Because otherwise, if the believers realized that we're about to fight 1,000 people, we have 313, we have a couple of swords and some sticks, it would have probably been hard. God made the Muslims see the enemy as being few. What else? God also made the enemy see the Muslims as a little bit, so they would feel bold enough to attack, because the war needed to happen. What God says, وَيُقَلِّلُكُمْ فِي أَعْيُنِهِمْ. He also made you seem few in number in their eyes. The battle started. Now, some fun facts. Shaitan, this is also God's help. So Shaitan came in the beginning, and this is one of the times where Satan came in a material form. So he takes the standard. These are ayat of the Quran, right? And he said, there is no one who can defeat you. Satan himself, Iblis, he was in the form of a human being, is carrying the standard, and he's marching and telling the enemy that they're not. Then Satan saw the armies of the Malaika. He threw down the flag. And the other guys are like, what are you throwing down? Like, creates panic. Anyhow, once the two sides met each other, God did something else. So the first time, in order to make it easy, God made the Muslims seem like few and them seem like few, so they would rush into one another. After that, immediately God made the Muslims seem like twice their original number. There's another verse of the Quran. So this is Surah 3 and verse number 13. 3, so Ali Imran 13. So let's follow this verse also and just see again how God's helping. He's changing, making the universe work for you. God says, قَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ آيَةٌ. So Surah Ali Imran, Surah 3 and verse number 13. God says, قَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ آيَةٌ فِي فِئَتَيْنِ الْتَقَتَا. There is a sign for you in the two groups when they met each other. فِئَةٌ تُقَاتِلُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. One group was fighting in the way of Allah. وَأُخْرَى كَافِرَةٌ. The second group was a non-believing group. This other group, what happened in the middle of the battle, once the two sides met each other, يَرَوْنَهُمْ مِثْلَيْهِمْ رَأْيَ الْعَيْنِ. God made them see the believers. All of a sudden, once the battle started, now Amirul Mu'mineen is killing your champions. Both sides rush into each other. Now suddenly the Muslims who you were thinking were small now seem like 600 people. Then God continues. He says, وَاللَّهُ يُؤَيِّدُ بِنَصْرِهِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. He explains this isn't something that was just for that group of people. He helps with his assistance whoever he pleases. And then he explains that this is a lesson for all. I want to give you a modern day example of this. One of the operations, there were two very important operations towards the end of the Iran-Iraq war, the imposed war. One of them is called Karbala 4, and one of them is called Karbala 5. In Karbala 4, the brothers, the believers, had made so much effort to go over and do this. They attacked from several locations. In several of the locations, they were able to break through the defenses of the enemy, but the area where they were trying to go through, the key to the whole operations, the believers couldn't break through. They ended up calling off the operation, and Saddam celebrated because they knew that they were planning this major operation. Saddam considered this the big victory, and it was so humiliating for the Iranians. He ended up sending his generals back home on vacation. Saddam never left throughout the war, but at this time, he went and made Hajj. Saddam, he made Hajj. They were parading the Iranian prisoners through the cities, right? Karbala 4 seemed like a complete failure, right? They weren't able to accomplish their major mission. The responsibility of the believers was to do another operation, same area, 15 days later, Karbala 5. Now, what was so difficult about Karbala 5? One of them are the fortresses of the enemy that, remember, they just couldn't break through. The other one, though, is that if you were moving heavy equipment, because they moved all of the equipment out, to move heavy equipment back into that area, you need cover. It's only 15 days. God made heavy fog come into that area. The dust was so thick, in some areas you couldn't see for a mile in front of you. And under that, then the believers were able to move the heavy equipment into the area. And God kept it there, 7 or 8 days there. More than that, the shock troops of the believers, they had to go through water to attack the other side. When you're going through water, you don't have any cover. There's nothing to guard you or hide you, right? You're going to have to attack your shock troops. You're going through minefields. What did God do? What God did was that he sent some ducks into the same area a few days before the operation. The ducks would sit on the water, right? They're about the head of the divers who were going to be the shock troops. And then God made a breeze blow from that side, so the ducks are bobbing on the water. So it's what happens is, on the night of the operation, full moon, but nobody can see what's happening because the ducks are bobbing in the water. So this is just some of the examples of what God will do to make you victorious. Now, the last thing that I'd like to explain is this. Salawat, please. So if you remember, brothers and sisters, I said that one of the things we needed to do was to talk about that third condition of faith, the area that many of the believers fail in. I mentioned in the last speech on the birth of the Imam, I said we need to deconstruct perhaps the biggest obstacle to the return of the Imam. Now, this is part of the genius of the leader. What the leader explains is that if you look at that lesson, later on look this up, it's called the outcome of prophethood. In the outcome of prophethood, the leader explains that the armies of the believers were always victorious if the followers had two conditions. what were the two conditions that the followers needed to have? And it doesn't make any difference. It could be Nabi Yahya, it could be Nabi Nuh, it could be Nabi Lut, it could be Imam Kadhim, it could be anybody, right? It's always the same. This is the genius of the leader, to be able to bring it out and break it down so it's so simple. What did the believers need to have? Two conditions. One of them was faith, the other was sabr. Whenever the believers had those two conditions, there's an external victory for Islam. Whenever the believers don't have those conditions, or they don't have them as much as is needed, then the wali is defeated. Okay. So now, on to our imam, the last imam. When you look at the conditions of faith for the believers, quranic faith, the ultimate victory, salvation in this world and the hereafter. One part of it was that we have intellectual conviction. One part of it was we had action producing faith. The other part of it is faith where there's no picking and choosing. The believers can't pick and choose. It has to be everyday faith, all day faith, whatever God says. And if that's not there, it's not considered iman according to Quran. So Allah in the Quran is very, very clear about this. In Surah 24, brothers and sisters, God will give one example of people who are picking and choosing when it comes to Islam. So 24 and verse number 47, we're going to see that God takes no prisoners. He's absolutely clear. He says, the end of the verse, 24:47, God says this, وَمَا أُولَٰئِكَ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ. The people who pick and choose, have their favorite parts of Islam, these people are not mu'mineen according to Quran. This isn't quranic iman. Now, question, how widespread is a disease like this nowadays? Where people, and it's not, they just don't know that you can't pick and choose and consider yourself mu'min. We're going to cover the ayat of the Quran. But if I'm picking and choosing, I don't have iman. I have a problem with this. That's not faith. It's not akhirah. It's not, but people don't know. So what happens is, the challenge is to get people to understand that. And we're going to go over it, inshallah, thoroughly. What true faith is. But what the leader mentions in the beginning of the book is that some people, when Islam is on their side, they're very quick to come over and Allah, Messenger, Rasul, right? When Islam is not on their side, then suddenly everything goes out the window. I heard a story, and I'm hoping, inshallah, it's not true. It's the month of Ramadan. Inshallah, it's not true. They said that once this guy called a church. When he called the church, he said, I'd like to speak to the head hog at the trough. And the secretary was offended. She said, do you mean the pastor? Well, you better call him the pastor. You don't get to call him the head hog at the trough. The man said, oh, I'm sorry. I was about to donate $10,000. The woman said, hold on. Porky just walked in. It can't be picking and choosing, right? Later on, we're going to cover the ayat of the Quran about this. What Imam Ali says is this, that ilm is hujjah. Now that I know, al-ilmu, let's read the hadith of the Imam. The Imam says this. He says that al-ilmu kulluhu hujjah. Knowledge, all of it is proof against the person, illa ma umila bih, except that which is acted upon. So inshallah, we ask that Allah give us tawfiq to continue to serve Him, to embrace Islam as is, and to share Islam as is. We end with salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Thank you, Shaykhna. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Inshallah, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the tawfiq to be able to really internalize these lessons from the Holy Quran and then to embody them within our thoughts and in our lifestyles and our actions, inshallah. Just a reminder, tomorrow again is the doors will open at 6:45 and our program will be at 7 inshallah. And then we'll end the speech with Salatul Jama'ah and then iftar together. So inshallah we'd love to see all of the mu'mineen out there tomorrow. And then there is a sign-up link that is going around, just like an RSVP link, so that we can make proper accommodations inshallah for the food. But with that, inshallah, everybody enjoy your first iftar. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إذا وقعت الواقعة ليس لوقعتها كاذبة خافضة رافعة. إذا رجت الأرض رجا وبست